Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Tuesday, October 28th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. How you doing, Jacob? Good morning.
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you. It is day 753 of the war. Hamas handed over the remains of another hostage last night, on Monday night. Israel is working to identify the body. That is after 6 days of waiting for an additional body or bodies to be handed over. The number of captives still held in Gaza is now 12. We'll discuss the plans in the U.S. government to implement the full 20 points of the ceasefire and the Trump administration's harsh criticism against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government over the advanced legislation to annex parts of the West Bank. All of that in just a moment. Stay with us. Okay, so Jacob, Israel and Hamas have not even gotten through the very first parts of the ceasefire, and the U.S. is extremely anxious to move into the issues of post-war management of Gaza, Hamas disarmament. We discussed the center that was set up in Kiryat Gat, but let's talk about this, how they're approaching it, the Trump administration, how they're looking at it and discussing it on that side of the ocean.
Sure. So what happened was with this agreement that was signed on October 9th is that while there had been this 20-point plan that Trump enrolled several weeks before, what the U.S. decided to do was split that up at the last minute because they recognized that getting an agreement on some of these thornier issues like Hamas disarmament or the post-war management of Gaza was going to be a lot more difficult. So let's just start with the hostage release, the initial Israeli withdrawal, and the humanitarian aid provisions. And that's what happened. They got that agreement and pushed the rest aside for later. So that the rest is considered what's called phase two. And while the Trump administration is saying phase two is already begun, President Trump had this tweet a couple of weeks ago announcing that phase two has started. There hasn't actually been an agreement on it. So the U.S. is kind of flying, just trying to create facts on the ground, hoping to get enough international consensus to move forward with the parameters that it would like to see. And it's starting with the CMCC, the Civil Military Coordination Center, that's going to be monitoring the ceasefire, but also serving as kind of a hub for these other parts of the 20-point plan. Those points include this concept of reconstruction. And Jared Kushner, one of the top U.S., I guess you could say, aides involved in this effort, because he's not technically a government official at this point, he's saying that we're going to maybe focus first on the areas that are under Israeli control, so the eastern part of Gaza. There's basically split in 50-50. But what I spoke to several Arab diplomats over the past few days, and there's a lot of concern with this decision or consideration of just splitting up Gaza, because there are a group of countries, and it was basically four that came together and are kind of working as a bloc. They have different opinions on the margins, but basically Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE feel that this effort to split Gaza that Kushner was talking about will ingrain the status quo. It'll keep Israel in the east and keep Hamas in the west. And they feel that the better solution would be to advance a more holistic approach where you involve a technocratic government that's linked to the Palestinian Authority, and through that you phase them in and work to isolate and weaken Hamas through that alternative government. And these four countries are actually willing, they say, to contribute troops or funds to this effort, but they have conditions for doing so related to the PA. Now, an Israeli official I spoke with close to Prime Minister Netanyahu said that basically they don't believe this concept of trying to phase out Hamas or isolate Hamas with a technocratic government, because they feel that as long as Hamas is there with weapons, nobody's going to come in and nobody's going to be able to succeed even if they do. And that therefore the priority should be focusing on Hamas disarmament. Now, when I asked one of the Arab diplomats I spoke with about this Israeli argument, he said that, well, I do concede the point that we are not interested in trying to, if these Arab countries are not interested, and no country is, he argued, in sending any troops to Gaza in order to fight Hamas. President Trump has said otherwise. He said that countries are calling him up and asking to do this. But this diplomat insisted that that's really not the case. We're willing to send troops to help with maybe border security or humanitarian aid security, or helping train Palestinian Authority troops. But this idea that we're going to be going sparring with Hamas in Gaza is not something that any of us are really interested in. And what the diplomat said is instead we can talk about disarming Hamas through a diplomatic agreement where they agreed to give up their heavy weaponry. That's something that Hamas senior officials in Hamas have indicated that they could be willing to do, but that leaves, even if they give up their missiles and rockets, that still leaves them with the guns and the AK-47s that they used to carry out October 7th and really terrorize Palestinian civilians in Gaza, as we've seen over these past few weeks. So that seems like it'll be a non-starter. There are a lot of other issues that kind of and conditions that come up when you start asking countries about whether they're what they're actually willing to do, and it's kind of more limited than what is seen. And I think that's what the U.S. is realizing over these past few days, is that they're hitting a lot of walls as they're trying to implement this phase 2.
Jacob, does it seem that these other countries in the US administration are sort of understanding anew that Hamas is a terrorist organization, is not a is not a government, is not a country or a nation in the same way that perhaps these other countries are?
I don't think there's been a shift in how these countries see Hamas, but I do think there seems to be maybe a slow shift from the US, which, if you listen to people like Steve Witkoff or even President Trump, who talk about Hamas will be treated fairly, and Witkoff making points about that they are a bit more ideologically flexible and aren't all destined to or determined to kill themselves, but actually what I think they're finding in these negotiations that have not really advanced regarding disarmament is that they're not as open to shifting into a different ideological bend regarding Israel or regarding the issue of weapons. I think that was something that, for some reason, President Trump kept saying that that Hamas had been willing to give up its weapons and even told the U.S. that it was prepared to do so. But that, my understanding, I don't know what he was basing that off of or what intelligence the U.S. was using, but that's not kind of the DNA of Hamas, which is a resistance organization that isn't going to be willing to give up its weapons unless there's a very massive shift in the dynamic between Israelis and Palestinians, where there is a Palestinian state there. But even in that case, I think there are people who argue that Hamas would not be willing to disarm. And I think this is just one of the many obstacles that they're hitting. What's interesting is that Secretary Marco Rubio a couple days ago did mention that they want to that they're starting to look at the possibility of doing a UN mandate for the ISF, the International Stabilization Force. Basically, the idea is that in order to get more countries on board, those countries are asking that it be through the UN in some fashion. Now, there are different levels to do this, whether it could be a peacekeeping force, which is the highest level and requires a Security Council resolution. What will be interesting to see in the coming days and maybe a couple weeks is whether or not Israel prefers to go with the route of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and Egypt, which seem to have more conditions for their support, be it the PA involvement, which Netanyahu doesn't want, or not accepting this notion that Gaza will turn into Lebanon, where Israel can strike basically every day. That's another thing that the Arab countries don't want to be involved in. So there's that track. Or there's the track of Qatar again, which is what Israel was using before October 7th. And obviously, there's been a lot of baggage there of that decision to do so. But with Qatar, my understanding is that they have a lot fewer conditions for their support, because what they're looking for is continued, basically, influence in Gaza, and are willing to foot the bill in order to stay involved and stay relevant and stay as a player that the U.S. needs to help move things along in Gaza. And there was one Arab diplomat I spoke with who said that Netanyahu could actually lean again on Qatar because it's easier than accepting a PA role that these other countries are demanding. So I guess it'll be probably, my understanding is Jared Kushner will have to make a decision about which he's going to push Netanyahu, and Trump will push Netanyahu to accept. But the last thing I was told by an Arab diplomat was that things will really be not going to be decided necessarily until Mohammed bin Salman visits the White House on November 18th, so just under a month. So the U.S. has time to prepare, because I think that's when if they want to lean on Saudi Arabia for this effort, that's when the decision will be made.
All right, so we have some time to see what happens there. Okay, let's take a break, Jacob, and when we're back, let's talk about this issue of the advanced legislation in the Netanyahu government and why that angered the U.S. and how it did. Stay with us. Okay, so there's that line that the Israelis can't treat us like we're Joe Biden, which really keeps on reverberating for me. And basically in reaction to the fact that Netanyahu's government went forward with this legislation to annex parts of the West Bank, and the Trump administration said they just couldn't believe that's what it felt like. They just could not believe that this kind of legislation was going forward in the midst of all these negotiations for the ceasefire. So that already now it's almost a week ago that was happening. How is it still reverberating now? In other words, what is happening with that now in the Trump administration, Jacob?
I think things have calmed down a little bit, and I think it partially because of how angry the U.S. got following these two bills that passed Wednesday of last week. They took place specifically while J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, was in town for a couple days.
Right as he was leaving, right? That's what it
Right.
felt
It
like as
was
he was getting on the plane.
Well, he was asked about it right when he was getting on the plane, and that's when he made the first criticism from the U.S. because there had been some quiet about it until then. But then he says basically he was very personally insulted by this, that there was a stupid political stunt. So it wasn't the type of criticism that you are used to hearing, I think, from Trump officials. Yes, they're sometimes critical of Israel or Netanyahu, but not specifically on this issue of the West Bank. We did have Trump say a few weeks earlier, a couple months earlier, that Israel was not going to be annexed. He wouldn't allow Israel to annex the West Bank. So that issue felt like it was put to bed. And I think that's where this anger came in with these two pieces of legislation that were passed, or at least advanced through a preliminary reading. So Prime Minister Netanyahu, once this comment came out from Vance, tried to play a little bit of damage control and issued this English statement where he basically blamed the bills being passed or advanced on opposition members and noted that only one disgruntled member of the Likud party, he's referring to Yuli Edelstein, who was booted from his committee a couple months ago, he was the only one who backed it, and that the principal members of the coalition opposed it. It was a bizarre framing to basically say that the ultra-Orthodox parties in Likud are the principal members of the coalition, whereas the religious Zionist and Otzma Yehudit far-right parties are not principal members, even though the latter two have much more prominent portfolios and are real movers and shakers in this government, more in many ways than the ultra-Orthodox parties are. And beyond that, it was simply false that didn't include the ultra-Orthodox members, because there were 4 members of one of the United Torah Judaism faction that did vote in favor of this legislation and helped it pass, in addition to those far-right MKs that are part of Netanyahu's coalition. So there was a lot of anger. After, I think, Vance, once he made those public statements, you started hearing murmurings from other officials that were willing to speak, but only anonymously. And there was one that I spoke with that you mentioned at the top, that the Israelis can't treat us like Joe Biden, which is quite, I think it was a way to also a backhanded slap in the face to Joe Biden, saying that this is what you guys do, like as if to say that he wasn't treated well by the Israelis. Even Trump officials are acknowledging that. And then there was a report in Channel 12 that cited another U.S. official who said that if Netanyahu keeps going, he'll F up the Gaza deal. And if he Fs up the Gaza deal, Donald Trump will F him. And he wasn't just saying F. So definitely a bit of anger from Washington following this decision. And I think Marco Rubio tried to explain it a little bit by saying a couple of days ago that if this legislation were to pass, we would basically lose all the countries who are offering to help stabilize Gaza, send troops to Gaza if this annexation moves goes forward. And I doubt the comments made the next day by Bezalel Smotrich about camels and Saudi Arabia, that the racist comment that he made, probably didn't help much either. And I think it seems like since then things have calmed down a bit, but on the condition that this issue doesn't come up again, which Netanyahu has assured the public and the Washington that it will not. I think the major takeaways is that this is just a shift from where the Trump administration was in this issue from February, where President Trump actually said he's considering making an announcement about backing Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. When he was asked about it, it was in that press conference, I believe, about the Gaza Riviera. So they've moved quite a bit since February. But at the same time, it's worth noting that a lot of the things that are happening on the ground there's a lot of de facto annexation really happening. There's been a lot of land expropriation that Bezalel Smotrich is in charge of in the defense ministry. The settler violence that's continued and gotten even worse. I think there was an attack a few days ago that involved, it was caught on film, involved a woman, a Palestinian woman being attacked as she was trying to harvest her olives on her family's land in the central West Bank. And that was something you don't typically see in terms of a woman being targeted. And these are happening every day. So that and causing some communities that are more marginalized, like the Bedouin in the West Bank, to flee. So Israel's taking over more land in that regard as well. So while, yes, the Trump administration is making sure that there's no formal annexation going on, there does seem to be different things happening on the ground.
De facto. Yeah. Thanks, Jacob. Okay. Thank you for all of that this morning. It's been good to hear your voice, as usual.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.